Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker of this wonderful conference, Shierry Nicholsen. She's a psychoanalyst in private practice in Seattle. She studied briefly with Adorno in Frankfurt in the 1960s and has translated several of his books, including Notes to Literature, Hegel, Three Studies, and Prisms, the latter with Samuel Weber. In addition to her book, Exact Imagination, late work on Adorno's aesthetics. Her essays have appeared in numerous volumes on Adorno and the Frankfurt School. So it's really a good privilege and wonderful to have you here, Shierry. She's going to talk about Adorno's Minima Moralia, Malignant Normality, and the Dilemmas of Resistance. So help me to welcome her.
So thank you, Samir, for inviting me, and Alessandro, and there you are, and Huyen for co-organizing and help. And thank you all for staying so late. And let's see, can you hear me all right? Okay, so I'm going to read. Adorno's Minima Moralia, Malignant Normality and the Dilemmas of Resistance. This is the epigraph from Adorno. The logic of history is as destructive as the people it brings to prominence. Wherever its momentum carries it, it reproduces equivalents of past calamity. Normality is death. Malignant normality is a term coined by Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who has researched situations of extreme destructiveness in their historical and social contexts. It refers, Lifton says, to an inhumane social actuality that is presented as normal, all-encompassing, and unalterable. Lifton coined the term in his study of Nazi doctors, with specific reference to Auschwitz. But it is, of course, not as though the fall of the Third Reich has meant the end of situations of malignant normality. Equivalents of past calamity, as Adorno puts it, can be produced in different contexts. Adorno's Minima Moralia is a key document for critical theory today, precisely because it addresses and describes the workings of malignant normality, both within a specific historical context and in the dynamics that recreate and are continuing to recreate it in different versions. Written during and immediately after the Second World War, its context is the malignant normality of the Nazi regime within the larger historical trajectory of advanced capitalism, as Adorno experienced it in his exile in Southern California. Intrinsic to Minima Moralia at the same time is a reflection on the slight possibilities of resistance within the totalizing nature of this malignant normality. The diagnosis of malignant normality and the possibility of resistance cannot be separated. In this way, too, Minima Moralia is a key document for critical theory in the present. The attempt to formulate this conjunction of a malignant normality and the possibility of resistance is by no means unique to Minima Moralia, and later I will refer to some historical and social psychological studies of resistance within extreme destructive situations. If Minima Moralia does not immediately strike us as belonging with such studies, this is because it takes articulations of and reflections on individual experience, and the individual experience of only one person, Adorno himself, as its data and its method of research, so to speak. Minima Moralia is not, however, a personal memoir of suffering, resistance, and survival, but rather a set of short texts on a wide diversity of historical, cultural, and personal topics. As its subtitle, Reflections on Damaged Life, indicates, in Minima Moralia, experience is intrinsically linked to critical thought. Adorno would argue that using reflection on individual experience as the basis for the analyses in Minima Moralia is not an arbitrary choice. It follows from the specific phase of the broader historical trajectory in which he is living. Against Hegel's notion of an overarching objective Weltgeist, Adorno claims in his dedication to Minima Moralia, social analysis can learn incomparably more from individual experience than Hegel conceded. In the period of its decay, the individual's experience of himself and what he encounters contributes once more to knowledge. I didn't correct the gendered translation. If the illusion of the individual's absolute autonomy has disintegrated, there are enough remnants of the individual left outside the leveling of contemporary society for its malignancy to be read in the individual's experience. If we ask what is malignant about the malignant normality Adorno addresses, in one sense, the answer is simple. It is inhumane and brutal. It promotes suffering. And if we ask what is normal about it, the answer is also simple, but less so. It is normal because the brutality is couched, at least in superficial ways, in accepted social norms. It is also normal in that the conjunction of brutality and social norms is experienced as being without exceptions or loopholes, just the way things are. In this sense, the malignant normality claims to be total and all-encompassing. Despite Adorno's frequent, if glancing, references to the economic basis of malignant normality, Minima Moralia is in no way an analysis of the reach of global capitalism. Rather, its impact depends on its very precise articulation of the experience of this encompassing malignancy. All-encompassing means precisely that. One is surrounded, literally, by the malignancy. Wherever we look, there is an aspect of malignancy, and there seem to be no exceptions. The diversity of the facets of experience addressed in Minima Moralia reflects this all-encompassing quality. The malignancy of contemporary reality includes not only the world of social relations and the concrete details of everyday life, but the material world of human-made products as well. Witness, for example, Adorno's discourse on the failure of contemporary doors to indicate privacy. And when Adorno, the emigre intellectual, complains in a text entitled Refuge for the Homeless that dwelling is now impossible, he is not so much waxing nostalgic for what once was, as noting, among other things, the uniform absence of humane welcome and comfort in the built environment. The all-encompassing malignancy works inward as well as outward, penetrating as well as encompassing, and destroying the distinction between internal and external experience. In this regard, the effect of malignant normality on sleep and dreams is telling. Adorno cites a German magazine proposing that modern man wants to sleep on the ground. In effect, Adorno states, abolishing with the bed the threshold between waking and dreaming. The sleepless are on call at any hour, he continues, unresistingly ready for anything, alert and unconscious at once. Adorno and others have documented the terror that underlies this form of normality. In Germany, from 1933 to 1939, Charlotte Barat, a psychoanalytically informed journalist, collected protocols of dreams, which the dreamers identified as depicting their experiences in the Third Reich. These dreams, she says, bear witness not to internal conflicts in the dreamer, but to the penetrating force of terror in life within a malignant totality. Here, for instance, is the dream of a 45-year-old doctor dreamed in 1934. Around 9 in the evening, after my office hours, as I am about to stretch out peacefully on the sofa in my apartment with a book about Matthias Grunewald, my room and my whole apartment suddenly become wall-less. I look around horrified, and all the dwellings around, as far as the eye can see, no longer have walls. I hear a loudspeaker blaring out, according to the decree of the 17th of the month regarding the elimination of walls. The next morning, the doctor wrote the dream down, and then he dreamed of being accused of writing down dreams. The distinction between reality and nightmare is eliminated along with walls. Individual nightmare and collective malignancy are thus two sides of the same thing. In a Minima Moralia text dating from 1935, Adorno describes the way his childhood memories of being mocked and bullied prophesied fascism. Now that the tormentors have stepped visibly out of my dream, he says, and dispossessed me of my past life and my language, I no longer need to dream of them. In fascism, the nightmare of childhood has come true. Society has, as it were, assumed the sickness of all individuals, he writes in another text in Minima Moralia. And in it, in the pent-up lunacy of fascist acts and their innumerable precursors and mediators, the subjective fate buried deep in the individual is integrated with its visible outward component. The surface of social relations and ordinary sociability becomes the normality of those whose individuality has been eliminated, sucked up into collective madness. Hence, Adorno can write, "Nothing is innocuous anymore. All collaboration, all the human worth of social mixing and participation merely masks tacit acceptance of inhumanity. Under capitalism, social relations are indistinguishable from commercial relations. Everything becomes a matter of connection or relationship in contemporary corporatist jargon." Adorno lays out the brutality of this deformation in a text called Health Unto Death. Neurosis and sexual repression, structures which rely on the distinction between inner and outer, waking and dreaming, conscious and unconscious in the individual, seem to have disappeared, he writes. But those who seem healthy, we might also say normal, are already dead. These are the ones who are ready for anything. The ingratiating qualities of these apparently healthy, connection-seeking people make them both temptingly attractive and confusing. Lifton devotes a chapter of his book, The Nazi Doctors, to Dr. Ernst B., a paradigmatic instance of what Adorno is talking about here. Lifton interviewed Ernst B. for many hours and was confused and suspicious when he initially found something likable in him. Indeed, Ernst B., who worked in a section of Auschwitz not directly engaged in killing, was thought by some prisoners to be an exception, a good Nazi. After the war, when Ernst B. was brought to trial for his wartime activities, he was acquitted, in part because of testimony by some of the Jewish prisoners that he had been nice to them. For Lifton, Ernst B.'s defining characteristic was his ingratiating sociability. He wanted to be liked, and he knew how to go about it. He was unusual in being on good terms with both his fellow SS doctors and the prisoner doctors he was in charge of. He got the prisoners to like him by calling them by name, and he got his fellow SS officers to like him by participating in their socializing. Indeed, he had joined the SS thinking of it as a good social club. And by the end of his interviews with Lifton, when he had apparently given up trying to ingratiate himself with Lifton, Ernst B. was waxing nostalgic about the good times of idealism and solidarity with his SS colleagues. If nothing is innocuous, everything represents a temptation to acquiesce in inhumanity. In an all-encompassing malignant normality, the pressure to conform is relentless. The iconic dream with which Barat begins her book, The Third Reich of Dreams, speaks to the process of being worn down until one's resistance is broken and one gives in. This is the dream of a factory owner in his 60s, a lifelong social democrat. He dreamt it 3 days after Hitler took power. Goebbels comes into my factory. He has the employees line up in 2 rows, right and left. I have to stand between them and lift my arm in the Hitler greeting, Heil Hitler. It takes me half an hour to lift my arm, 1 millimeter at a time. Goebbels watches my exertions as though he were at a play, without applause and without any expression of displeasure. But when I have finally raised my arm, he says 5 words, "I don't want your greeting," turns around and goes to the door. So I stand in my own factory among my own employees, pilloried with my arm raised. I am physically able to do so only by keeping my eyes on Goebbels' clubfoot while he is limping away. I stand this way until I wake up. This man kept dreaming this dream over and over until finally, in his dream, his back broke. With the exhaustion of the effort to resist comes also the temptation to self-mutilation, to stupefaction or self-confusion, the destruction of our own mental capacities, as a defense against the pressures of the malignant situation. The dream of a German cleaning woman from the summer of 1933 illustrates this. I dreamt that as a matter of caution, I speak Russian in my dream, a language I don't know at all, and besides, I don't talk in my sleep. I speak Russian in my dream so that I won't understand myself, and so no one can understand me, in case I say something about the state, because that is, of course, forbidden and would have to be reported. The malignant normality's pressures to conform, along with the corruption and stupefaction that are the consequence of conforming, extends to all situations in life. The professions, with their humanitarian ideals, are not exempt from such perversion. Lifton, himself a psychiatrist, emphasizes the vulnerabilities of professionals of all kinds. They can be tempted by money, by fame, by closeness to those in power, by the opportunity for scholarly contributions, among others. Lifton's book, The Nazi Doctors, is a study of the perversion of the medical profession, which was grounded on the Hippocratic oath to preserve life, but in the Third Reich comes to define its duty as killing. Lifton details the Nazis' recruiting of professionals to head agencies engaged in a variety of forms of medicalized killing. Nothing does more to sustain malignant normality than its support from a large organization of professionals, he notes, in his foreword to the 2017 book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Much in Minima Moralia speaks to the particular difficulties that the all-encompassing malignant situation poses for the professional work of someone in Adorno's position as an émigré intellectual. Every intellectual in emigration is, without exception, mutilated and does well to acknowledge it to himself, Adorno writes. He evokes the sense of being hampered by isolation, unfamiliarity, or financial need, of constantly working against the grain, of becoming exhausted, and in one's exhaustion being tempted to abandon one's standards for one's work. The effort of producing something in some measure worthwhile is now so great as to be beyond almost everybody, he writes. The pressure of conformity weighing on all producers further diminishes their demands on themselves. The center of intellectual self-discipline as such is in the process of decomposition. For Adorno, as intellectual and philosopher, language, the very medium of his work, presents temptations to acquiesce in the inhumanity of malignant normality. The intellectual has no choice but to use language, and language, like the tools of other professions, can be co-opted in the service of maintaining the semblance of normality in a malignant situation. In his book, States of Denial, Awareness of Atrocities and Suffering, for instance, Stanley Cohen details some of the ways language can be perverted into accounts that serve to justify or excuse and thereby deny atrocities. It can be used to deny responsibility for the actions, to deny that injury was done, to deny that victims are victims and not perpetrators, to condemn those who condemn the atrocities, and to appeal to alleged higher ends that would justify the actions. The émigré intellectuals hope that writing in particular will be exempt from the pressures of a malignant normality, that it will serve as a refuge. The hope that for the man who has no homeland, writing becomes a place to live. That is an illusion, itself a form of denial. On the contrary, the difficulties that beset the émigré intellectual can serve as a pretext for indulging in writing that would otherwise be rejected as trash, or can lead to a wariness that stifles the free flow of energy necessary for serious writing. In either case, language becomes infected with social control and serves the denial through stupefaction that we saw in the dream quoted above, in which the dreamer tried to protect herself by dreaming in the language she did not understand. I'm sure you're thinking of all sorts of contemporary parallels and connections with the other talks, and I won't say them, but you can say them later. To recapitulate, malignant normality puts forth the claim to be all-encompassing, normal, and unalterable. I have stressed its all-encompassing nature, extending from the human-made environment to the unconscious itself. The claim to constitute the norm can be seen in the sociability of those subjected to the health unto death that Adorno talks about, those whose capacity for differences has been eviscerated. Intertwined with these is malignant normality's convincing claim to be unalterable, based on its power to seduce, pressure, exhaust, and stupefy those who might resist even in dreams. So I want to turn now to the way resistance is presented in Minima Moralia. As Stanley Cohen remarks of denial, the question may be not so much why we resort to denial, but why do we ever not do so? Minima Moralia poses the same question about resistance. The question is not so much how entanglement in malignant normality comes about, but how it is ever possible to resist it. And yet, the possibility of resistance is as much the theme of Minima Moralia as is the overwhelming force of malignant normality. Adorno claims that no matter what, resistance is possible, even if barely and precariously. In part, this is the case because malignant normality's claim to constitute the totality of reality is not tenable. It is an illusion propagated by the forces of malignancy. Note, by the way, that a central premise of Lifton's work is that totalization, the claim to absolute totality, is the hallmark of genocidal groups and dynamics. Absolute totality is both destructive and impossible, a contradiction in terms. This is one meaning of Adorno's dictum, the whole is the false. If there can be no absolute totality, resistance as that which is outside or different from the totality is always possible, at least in principle. Accordingly, Minima Moralia is framed as an argument with Nietzsche as well as an argument with Hegel. if with Nietzsche we accept that a universal moral law is no longer tenable, still, Adorno says, the amor fati, embracing one's fate, that Nietzsche counsels, represents acceptance of the status quo in the form of resignation. On the contrary, precisely because of the all-encompassing nature of malignant normality, in Minima Moralia, the question of resistance arises everywhere, in the actions of everyday life, in the social relations of the émigré intellectual, in the activities of thought and writing. For Adorno, the individual is the site of this potential resistance. In part, this claim is based on the argument against Hegel. For Hegel, a rational Weltgeist proceeds to the end of history and ultimately completely subsumes the individual in the general. But, Adorno contends, first of all, the trajectory of history has been proven to be destructive rather than rational. The great historical categories, after all that has been perpetrated with them, he says, are no longer above suspicion of fraud. Along the way, the bourgeois individual, once touted as the apex of civilization, the site and beneficiary of autonomous moral principles and freedom, has been revealed to be ideological to the core. At the same time, the forces of sameness produced by global capitalism and the culture industry have made that individual obsolete, replaced in its substance by society. But while the individual's capacity for experience shrinks under the onslaught of the forces of malignant normality, to the degree that it survives in the form of a cast-off waste product, the capacity for experience falls outside the totality and thereby becomes relevant for its critical potential. As a locus of difference, quote, something of the force of protest has passed over again into the intellectual. As historically obsolete, the individual becomes the custodian of truth as the condemned against the victor, the site both of complicity in malignant normality and resistance to it. Despite his studies of the personality traits that make individuals susceptible to authoritarianism, when Adorno speaks of the individual in Minima Moralia, he is not thinking of specific personality types or psychopathologies that would determine which individuals collude and which resist. He is scornful, for instance, of the idea of the mad Nazi, understood in terms of individual psychopathology. Hitler may be pathological in himself, Adorno writes, but what he is in the whole is what matters. Essentially, Adorno is concerned not with who can resist, but rather with what it is in the individual that constitutes resistance. Analogously, again, by the way, in his foreword to The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which is a group of essays by mental health professionals, Lifton emphasizes that it is not Trump's personality, but rather his contribution to malignant normality that make him dangerous. Adorno is certainly not the only one to consider the question of the possible bases for resistance in the individual. Jonathan Glover, for instance, in his book Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, asks what kind of moral resources might be available to people in the face of inhumane forces, once it is clear, again, after Nietzsche, that the idea of a universal moral law is untenable. Glover names three: rational self-interest, the human responses of sympathy and respect, and one's moral identity, the sense of the morality necessary for one's self-respect. In another example, in their study of the motivations of individuals identified by Yad Vashem as rescuers of Jews during the Nazi period, Samuel and Pearl Olener identified three motivations: an empathic response to the needs and suffering of the other, a normocentric response based on the norms of a group, or an autonomous principled response. Formulations like Glover's or the Uhliner's lend themselves to thinking about instances of individual resistance, like the following two, which I've taken from Lifton's work. Marie L., a prisoner doctor in Auschwitz, refused absolutely and repeatedly to perform harmful surgeries on fellow prisoners. She, like other prisoners, believed that none of them was likely to survive Auschwitz. Quote, "So the one thing left to us is to behave for the short time that remains to us as human beings," she said. When confronted by the Nazi authorities, she explained that the activities she was being ordered to perform were contrary to her conception of herself as a doctor. In another example, think of the US soldier who, during the massacre at My Lai, simply walked around with his gun pointed at the ground and was heard muttering, "It's wrong, it's wrong." This man, Lifton suggests, had found himself when he joined the army and experienced the massacre as a revolting affront to military ideals. In these instances, we might think of Glover's moral identity or the Uhliner's internalized norms. Like Lifton, the primary focus of whose work is the way individuals adapt to the power of external forces, these thinkers understand that the individual bases for resistance which they identify operate within larger historical and social cultural contexts. But Adorno's interest in resistance is focused neither on the individual personalities, motivations, or resources, nor on the particular circumstances in which resistance can or cannot take the form of overt actions or refusals to act. For him, the all-pervasiveness of malignant normality, its quasi-total web of entanglements, its penetration of the individual mind and psyche, all mean, as I said earlier, that the possibility of resistance, however precarious and distorted, exists everywhere. Adorno is interested in formulating this resistance as the act of self-reflection on the individual's own experience from what he calls the perspective of redemption, which we heard about earlier. The only philosophy which can be responsibly practiced in the face of despair, he says in the final text of Minima Moralia, is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. Perspectives must be fashioned, he continues, that displace and estrange the world, reveal it to be, with its rifts and crevices, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. I want to point out several things here. First, when Adorno uses the words redemption or messianic, or when he uses, as he does elsewhere, the word utopia, he does not mean something concretely specified in pragmatic or conceptual terms. To even ask the question of the goal of an emancipated society is illegitimate, Adorno writes. The utopian hope implicit in resistance does not consist of promises of a paradise of unrestrained production and abundance, or indeed unrestrained realization of human potential. These would merely reproduce the capitalist apparatus of production. Rather, it consists in the hint of freedom from constraint. Second, rather than looking toward a utopia, Adorno is concerned with a perspective from which the present reality can be seen in its malignancy, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. Third, taking the standpoint of redemption may furnish a hint of freedom, but at the same time, it is virtually impossible to achieve a standpoint removed even by a hair's breadth, he says, from what is. And further, whatever is gained in the struggle will itself be distorted by the status quo, that is, the all-encompassing malignant normality from which it has been wrested. This is the dilemma of resistance. though it may not manifest itself in overt heroic actions, individual or collective, it nevertheless requires doing something that is almost impossible and that can never be definitive and pure, uncontaminated by its context. To circle back for a moment, the hair's breadth shift of perspective that is the basis for resistance is dependent on the individual's status as a cast-off remnant, different from the malignant quasi-totality. It is this difference that provides the possibility of self-reflection. Self-reflection is not reflection in the abstract, but rather reflection on the individual's own entanglement. Therein lies both the limitation and the redemptive value of self-reflection. While there is no way out of entanglement, at the same time, awareness of entanglement represents the hair's breadth of a perspective on it. Thus, for Adorno, the intellectual in exile, mutilated and isolated, is a detached observer who is, however, as much entangled as the active participant. And the only advantage of the detached observer is insight into his entanglement and the infinitesimal freedom that lies in knowledge as such. Another way of putting this would be to say that the individual's self-reflection on the experience of entanglement is an exercise of thought that unfolds the intrinsic dialectic of what it reflects on. In Hegelian terms, in other words, the individual self-reflection is an activity of determinate negation. As Adorno puts it, consummate negativity, once squarely faced, delineates the mirror image of its opposite. Okay, last section. I want to focus now on the notion of experience and its role in the possibility of resistance. For Adorno, the obsolete individual represents difference from the status quo, and thus is the locus of potential resistance, because the individual who has not been completely taken over by what Adorno calls the health unto death, the standardization and homogenization produced by malignant normality, is that individual who has not been completely taken over is still capable of experience. Experience for Adorno is complex, specific, individual, and contingent. Knowledge, Adorno says, for instance, comes to us through a network of prejudices, opinions, innervations, self-corrections, presuppositions, and exaggerations. In short, through the dense, firmly founded, but by no means uniformly transparent medium of experience. It is this dense and opaque medium of experience, its eccentric complexity, that makes it both the target of obliteration and at the same time ultimately indigestible by the health unto death. We can think of the eccentric contingency of experience as the complement to the perspective of redemption. It is within the medium of experience that self-reflection takes place, mediating the various aspects of individual capacity from the perspective of redemption so that they become genuine carriers of hope and thus resistance. Without such mediation, each of the factors that might be heralded as the basis of resistance, thought, truth, morality, rationality, knowledge, or the irrational in its various forms, each of them can work against the possibility of resistance, colluding with malignant normality by promoting the denial and self-deception that produce stupefaction. Regarding, for instance, the polarity of thought and feeling, Adorno writes, the assumption that thought profits from the decay of the emotions, or even that it remains unaffected, is itself an expression of the process of stupefaction. Similarly, thought and truth, unmediated by subjective experience, are both vulnerable to colluding with malignant normality. Thought does so insofar as it claims objectivity, claims to see the status quo as truth. It is the cardinal untruth, Adorno writes, having recognized existence to be bad, to present it as truth simply because it has been recognized. That's resignation, bowing down to the powers that be. Genuine truth, or true objectivity, in contrast, depends not purely on thought, but on the hope that flows from and constitutes the perspective of redemption. In other words, resistance can base itself on truth only when truth takes the form of hope. In the end, writes Adorno, hope wrested from reality by negating it is the only form in which truth appears. Without hope, the idea of truth would be scarcely even thinkable. The dialectic of subjectivity and objectivity is central here. Whereas power reverses objectivity and subjectivity, Adorno says, according objectivity to the status quo and dismissing as merely subjective that which engages the specific experience of a matter. In fact, the genuinely objective is available only through genuine subjective experience, in the sense of what I have called the eccentric complexity of experience. Its engagement with the specificity of its object is what constitutes the determinate negation of reality, which in turn represents hope. Hope appears in the experience of the obsolete individual, subjective and objective at the same time, not as something substantial and definitive, but as a kind of aura of freedom from coercion. True thought, the ally of hope, may be inadequate to provide us a systematic and coherent picture of experience, Adorno writes, but this inadequacy resembles that of life, which describes a wavering, deviating line, disappointing by comparison with its premises, and yet which only in this actual course, always less than it should be, is able under given conditions of existence to represent an unregimented one. Okay, finale. Hegel may have been wrong about the cumulative rationality of the whole, but for Adorno, he was not wrong about history having a trajectory. For Adorno, and for us today, and no doubt into the future, the turn of the historical screw continues in the direction of greater suffering. It is not that things are always the same. What is constant is not an invariable quantity of suffering, but its progress toward hell, says Adorno, not only in the development of forces of production, but also in the increasing pressure of domination does quantity change into quality. If, as Adorno says in his introduction to Minima Moralia, those who speak of the individual in the face of unspeakable collective events are complicit, nevertheless, even as the individual becomes ever more complicit and resistance becomes ever less possible, still resistance depends upon hope, which still resides in individual experience and its potential for reflection. Beside the demand thus placed on thought, these are the concluding words of Minima Moralia, the question of the reality or unreality of redemption itself hardly matters. Engagement with this demand is what Adorno's Minima Moralia urges us to today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a rich presentation that I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought for all of us. I have kind of one comment and a couple of questions, and then I will pass to everyone. I have the impression that in your text you present Adorno as the analysant himself. And I don't know if it is because your position or your training as an analyst, but I hear this singular universality that he conveys very clearly in his reflection in Minima Moralia particularly. And it just impacted me quite sharply. Yeah, that this kind of really deep introspection from the position of the excluded unconscious. Mm-hmm. That's a comment. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of the malignant normativity, how is that related to the death drive, or why not calling the death drive? That's one question. And the other is, what could be the conditions that could allow socially the project of redemption, or this ability to really look into the reflection of the experience, pretty much?
Death drive, I'm pretty sure Adorno never talks about that. When he talks Freud, he talks sexuality, aggression, destructiveness, but not death drive. So do you want to say more of how that comes to your mind? Here?
Yes. Well, obviously, it's coming from my Lacanian perspective, that for Lacan, the death drive, it's the drive, right? It's the erotic drive, and its excess leads to the death drive, right? It's the drive by itself, it has the entropy or the entropic quality that leads to excess and destruction, right? In that sense, even he calls the libido leads to the strudo, right? So I was thinking that the malignant normality had like at the core the drive, and I was wondering if for Adorno had some
I suppose
resonance.
you could say that from that perspective, that the death drive is driving the trajectory of history.
Yes.
But I think Adorno would say more it's the increasing concentration of capital and the destructive social conditions that are driving it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe the materialization of the drive through the social and the economic model. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So. Yes. And the redemption, is there any thought about the redemption? What could be the conditions for a project of redemption, if any? You know,
I really tried to, I think it's really there in Minima Moralia, I really tried to emphasize that as far as Adorno seems to be concerned, I experience this room, I look at it in connection with the structure of university life, et cetera, and from whatever resources of my complexity of my experience, I have the sense it could be different in a better way. And that's what the perspective of redemption is. I think it's not it's a very tantalizing word, but I don't think it's meant to be, it's meant to be difficult, almost impossible, but it's not meant to be mystifying, and maybe it turns out mystifying.
Okay.
There are probably other people have stuff to say about that.
Yeah, definitely. And if you wait for the microphone so it can be recorded. Thank you.
Picking up on this theme, you were thinking of death instinct, and I was thinking something else. Malignant normalcy is, to me, life preservative drive. It's something that Freud talked about early in his writings, but then left after the 1920 and the beyond the pleasure principle, where he talked about the death instinct and life instinct, but the dual model of the mind. Now, I bring this up because not everybody left the life preservative instincts. In fact, Sandor Ferenczi wrote about it extensively much later in his career. and considered that that was one of the driving forces that push individuals towards compromises in health. Mm-hmm. Like a psychosis could be life preservative drive. Mm-hmm. Compromise, which makes life possible, is certainly something that we can all identify with. But Freud didn't write about it very much. Mm-hmm. And I recognized redemption in a film I saw recently. Terrence Malick's new film, A Hidden Life, in which...
What's it called again?
A Hidden Life, 2019. I saw it at the Film Fest. Uh-huh. I'm not going to tell you the plot, but it's an instance where a person has to exhibit tremendous courage of conviction to resist malignant normalcy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Samir was talking about this beforehand, that if the person wants to survive, they have to participate, and that has consequences for them. And it's, yeah. And Adorno's describing that for the intellectual. Yeah.
Well, funnily enough, that's essentially what I wanted to ask about. So my question will come just after a preface with a kind of comment, which I think is really there's a very resonant passage from one of Adorno's lectures on negative dialectics. I think it was like 1965 or something, 66, where he says that he really didn't consider negativity as playing such an important role in his thinking until his years of exile, where he noticed that there was this compulsion to, and he uses the term, identify with the aggressor. Uh-huh. And so negativity was about resistance, right? It was resisting this compulsion to identify with essentially the status quo. And in We Refugees, Arendt has some very interesting things to say on a very sort of in a parallel way about the kind of exigencies and the compulsions of being an emigre. And I think this was really, really quite fascinating in the context of a text now thinking about Minima Moralia, where he's thinking so much about homelessness, about dwelling, about writing, and you correctly point out that he sort of poses the possibility of dwelling in one's writing, but then he takes it away for the reasons you pointed out. But I think that posing and offering, in a sense, taking away means something interesting insofar as there's a question of style here. So he's refusing the kind of identification with the aggressor at the level of style, at the level of discourse, and there's a different kind of style that is insisted upon, which you see. I mean, this is a beautifully written text. It's aphoristic, and he writes as you've translated the essay as form, and his insistence on a paratactical style. Yeah. These are forms of resistance, aren't they? So there's that stylistic dimension. But when he talks about education after Auschwitz, he talks about education specifically for contradiction, Widerspruch, and resistance. So I think that there's both this kind of attempt to engage in pedagogy, right? You gave the example of the students, and there's an attempt to open up the discourse, open up the style, but then there's this more philosophical and literary hermetic dimension. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
That's nice. I like that. I was thinking about the aphoristic things, or the things I call constellations, where there will be several things that you can connect with association, but the associations are not spelled out, and they're juxtaposed in a way, which is a little bit like, and who was it that Ed was saying about the weapon of the quote in the middle of the paragraph, which I thought was a great image. So it's like he'll put this out and he'll say, okay, Or you have to make the connection here. I'll put this out. Well, did you get that one? Now try this one. It makes demands on the reader, I think is one way of saying it. And when he talks in the music, the pedagogical music essay, about what the listener has to do is follow the music, and actually he uses the word co-compose. The listener has to co-compose the music or recompose it afterwards, right after, create the structure in his own mind, which is like encouraging contradiction, encouraging resistance.
And releases too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, yeah.
Jerry.
Just a few points, Shierry. It's bracing to hear you talk about the individual. Those of us who started reading Adorno in the 60s, not completely understanding where he was going in a disciplinary way. That is to say, is this sociology? Is it psychology, right? You know this. What are we reading? What are we trying to understand with this person who's probably in the future will be looked back as the most important figure, I think, in 20th century political thought and aesthetic thought, and in your terms, how one understands the resistance. But it seems like what you've done is bring back the individual in a way, which was Adorno's difficulty. How do you talk, I mean, even in his Kierkegaard study, you remember the power-protected individual, right, is so deeply ingrained, embedded, even in the Enlightenment, that it requires a different way of thinking, a different way of thinking about where we are, not only in terms of fascism, but in terms of intellectual thought itself. And I think you've brought out something extremely important about that Adorno could see miles away the causes of the disintegration of the individual, right? He felt it in himself. He felt the suffering in himself. At some point, I think in Negative Dialectics, he says something like, we are free to suffer, but not to inflict suffering on others. But we have to have that freedom in ourselves to understand what this suffering is all about, right? But what I took from what you said there in terms of Charlotte Berat, those dreams, and I've written something about those dreams not fairly recently. Yeah. If anyone, those dreams were about the past as well as not just prognostic about the future. Bettelheim and Koselleck read those dreams in some ways as prognostic of the Holocaust, of the genocide, which could not be prophesized. It could not be possibly predicted. But what those dreams did for Berat is to show that there was a continuity with the past and the unpast, which the individual in that particular culture and time had resisted understanding after World War I. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. I was not aware of it reading them, but it's an interesting thing.
She quotes Kafka, she quotes Brecht, she quotes Arendt, she quotes Simone Weil, as if to say those dreams were prognosticated the most heinous possible acts that human beings could imagine.
Their dreams, the ones I quote, are just right from 1933, 1934. So, and you would have imagined they were from much later, but they're right away, so they're prognostic in that sense.
But they were, as you pointed out in that wonderful phrase, what they did is point out in everyday life the malignant narcissism of the system itself.
Yeah.
But they had no language no political, social language, because the institutions themselves could not frame the language in itself. So the dreamers were left, the dream was undreamt in terms of the way in which these dreams could possibly have been understood by those people who were being humiliated, ashamed in everyday life, right? That's my point. And Adorno is so sensitive to the fact that individuals in their everyday life are being humiliated, insulted, ashamed, and they don't know why. And the identification with the commodity system has prevented that kind of insight into understanding, well, why is this happening to me?
Yeah.
Why do I feel like this? Right? It's a footnote to what you've said.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really great. Reminded me of the Adorno I've read. Now, I haven't read him in the original German. So one of the things I'm curious about, as kind of also a footnote to what you were saying, is whether the word for experience that he uses is Erfahrung.
Oh, whether it's Erfahrung or Erlebnis,
Yeah.
you know, along with Benjamin. I actually don't know. I bet Samir would know, but he's not here. Do you know, Jerry? Erfahrung.
It's
okay.
Erfahrung, right?
As
Because
opposed to an Erlebnis, like a little specific experience.
yeah, because I think in English there's this ambiguity where experience means both of those, both lived experience and this kind of experience that you learn over time.
Right. I mean, I don't think in Minima Moralia, I mean, this is just an impression, that he speaks of an experience. I think he speaks of experience as the medium of life, if you like.
Right. No, I think I just wanted to kind of make that clarification, because otherwise we end up with Leibniz and therefore life philosophy or these kind of, and life philosophy is more or less what led to Nazism to begin with. So we can't privilege experience in a crude way, let's say.
Right, yeah.
If I could just add to this,
Please.
the connection of Erfahrung to journeying is really important in both Benjamin and Hegel. I think Adorno takes an Erfahrung.
Say that again.
The connection to journeying. Benjamin says, he was had an experience, has story to tell.
Okay.
Journey.
Yeah.
So the root of a thought is to travel.
Thank you for the talk. I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about previous discussions that we had here about the subject and kind of the Kantian subject and the Adorno's and Horkheim's critique of that sort of model of enlightenment. And then this question of where does the resistance come from in the face of malignant normalcy, and how maybe that's like, in what way do you see this sort of what was said here, this type of individuality that's resistant in even the slightest sort of ways, to what extent that is related or resists or informed by kind of that Kantian subject in negative ways or resisting ways?
I mean, people will probably want to say things about this also. It seems to me that Adorno is certainly emphasizing what I call the eccentric contingency of experience, which I don't know that Kant would talk about, right? On the other hand, Adorno is certainly interested in talking about genuine truth, genuine morality, genuine thought. So he has a sense of some valid version of all those things, but they all have to be very mediated. Yeah. You want to say anything about
Yes, I wanted to follow up with my questions, and a little bit of Jerry points out the individual that you brought in your reading of Adorno, and how in the way you presented Adorno, it moves away from kind of a prescriptive psychology. I mean, I don't know Adorno that well in terms of the different periods of his writing or his own dialectics, but yeah, I'm familiar with several of his readings, or writings rather, my readings. But then it seems like he comes from a place at some point of, for example, in working through the past, right? Like, let's educate, this pedagogy. But in Minima Moralia, he's like, let that project like fall in terms of it's about recuperating the experience of the individual that represents, in a way, all of us. Certain universality. I was reading that, and my question about the redemption is not so much that I heard the mystification, but I wanted almost like emphasize this part of non-totality, right? Like, it's not that he is giving the solution,
Right.
right? It's like, it's really difficult, he's kind of saying, right?
Yeah,
And
you'll get a hint, you'll get a whiff.
yes,
But
yeah.
the whiff will remind you, oh, yeah.
And that, I think, that is, it's very important, and at the same time it's very difficult to hold, because we always tried heuristically to approach a phenomenon, to try to solve or to try to come with some solution, no?
Yes, right.
And he's just like putting there this dialectic and this difficulty and this contradiction, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, the word prescriptive. I'm reminded again of what I brought up after Samir's talk in the lecture about Rechtsradikalismus. And he says, he really gives a prescription. He says, don't try to appeal to their shame and their morale, that they should be good people. Talk to them about their real interests. Now, that's a prescription for activism, basically. And describe the propaganda tricks that they are using. Describe them the way you would in analysis. Describe the self-contradictory thought and feeling and behavior of the patient. So, and that's also an activity. I mean, that's the way in which the dialectical reflection is an active practice. That, yeah. Yeah.
Any other
Are we done?
questions?
We have time for couple of more questions. Samir, again.
Yes.
This last point of yours, Shierry, also just reminds me of something I meant to say when you raised this notion of trying to address sort of objective interests of those who are attracted to the far right. I think another kind of prescription that comes out of the authoritarian personality study is that you can't actually engage in rational discourse with those who are, authoritarian or, leaning in that direction, because they see this as a sign of weakness, and it then becomes, in a sense, fuel to the fire. And I think that this is important today because so much of the left has become, melancholic in Wendy Brown's analysis, that it has become so fixated on its own sense of victimhood. Victimhood becomes elevated into a kind of location from which to speak. Those who are more victimized have more time to speak. Everybody else has to sit down and shut up. Intrinsically, that's just bad, I think. But even more so, it seems to also then have this effect of fueling the fires of the far right and a kind of pouncing on perceived weakness. And I think so. I think there's much we can learn from this work on authoritarianism. Thanks for raising it.
I mean, it's also that you can't talk abstract reason with the far right because, as Adorno puts it, there is no actual platform. There's no connection with reality. It's a web of slogans around a delusion. I mean, this Rechtsradikalismus is really good. Except, I think it's only in German so far.
I think it's being translated by Paul.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah. Somebody?
Any last question? Comment?
We wore everybody
Yes,
out.
one more.
Yeah.
Okay, so this time to actually ask a question. I wonder then how Adorno would see the link between experience and sociability or sociality, because you also made a point about him believing that sociability is malignant, right? Malignant normativity.
Well,
So what would for
it becomes
Adorno?
part of the malignant web. I mean,
Yeah.
if you've ever gone to a corporate happy hour, I mean, I have patients who work in corporations, and to disentangle anything they might be saying from the corporate jargon is a lot of work. Yeah, yeah, it's a different kind of authenticity, right? Yeah, so it's not that presumably one might have a whiff of sociability that would be more real, but to see the work of maintaining normality and maintaining deceit in a lot of social intercourse is important. That's what he's talking about. Yeah. I mean, the active work of denial that goes on constantly. Yeah.
And just one question, since we have a little bit of time. What could be the principles that Adorno sees for authenticity? Because I'm thinking from Lacan, let's say, the production of your own kind of master signifier, the connection of truth and knowledge, kind of the process of getting at that, could be kind of the authentic or the genuine. I'm trying to think that could be in Adorno, but do you have any kind of coordinates to how Adorno thinks authenticity of
I'll say one thing about it, and then we'll ask Stephanie, because she's the authenticity expert. So the thing I would say is Adorno uses this term genuine this and genuine that. And that's his signal for, here's my concept of authentic truth, authentic morality, authentic relationship between thought and feeling, whatever. So it's not, you should eat whole wheat bread instead of this. It's not that kind of stuff. It's more like, there is genuine thought, and try to engage in it.
Right. But yeah, my question comes from trying to understand if there's an articulation of what constitutes genuine. But maybe Stephanie can say something.
Could I kind of bastardize what Hilda just said
Wait for them. Yeah.
and see if I can tease out a couple of words in the from. Okay, I'll still closer. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of oversimplify where Hilda was going by asking if I can tease out some thoughts from you, of course, in this particular Adornian framework, about something as I said, it's going to be very simple, but in which way is all of this then kind of a dialectic between the principle and the value?
Between
Principles and values.
and knowledge?
No, principles and values.
Principles and values.
I don't follow, actually. A dialectic between principles and values?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard things about, individual, that we can read individual, in what you presented. So, between, the principles, that the individual adheres to, right? And the sense of values. Is there a...
Maybe some, that
As I said,
I'm not
it's
connecting with Adorno as
oversimplified.
thinking in those terms.
Okay, that's
maybe,
fair.
But
That's
somebody
fair.
else might have something
That's
to say.
fair.
Yeah, for the genuine expert.
It's why, on the question of authenticity, I think that's as much an aesthetic question as it is an ethical or moral or political one, or psychological one. Those who have studied Adorno, and you've studied him, translated him more than most of us, the question of authenticity is an ongoing, continuous resistance to that which is inauthentic, right? But the evidence for this, not just psychoanalytically, but the evidence for this is in the aesthetic work. And I think in his essays on music, which you know better than probably than anyone, the totality, the configuration that goes beyond representation of the individual is where the experience of authenticity, if one is brave enough and open enough to the experience, to the Erfahrung, one can find evidence for this kind of authenticity. But I would say that the authenticity is in the aesthetic configuration of the work itself. If you translate that aesthetic configuration back into some concept of the individual, or the individuum in the individual, who is an unfinished project, one gets some sense of what he means by the genuine, right? Whatever that word, the danger of that word falling into the trap, of belonging your patient, belonging to the corporation, belonging, right, to the community, which is what Lifton was, I take it, what Lifton was saying, that the normal path is the most dangerous person, but doesn't know it. It has no insight into its own malignant narcissism.
That Ernst B. had a good friend. No, he didn't want to participate in selections at the ramp when they were bringing the Jews. So he got somebody in Berlin to send someone to take his place. And that guy did it one day and then became catatonic, and which apparently was not that unusual. And so in the morning, they kind of got him and prescribed a psychotherapeutic protocol for him, which consisted of he'd get to work with this very famous prisoner doctor. And yeah, because he had said, no, I didn't come, I'm a doctor, I believe in living, not killing. And he then decided that he could finish his doctoral dissertation by staying there and taking their offer of working with this famous guy. So what you were saying reminded me of that, in the sense that there was some initial, it's obvious this is no good. Obvious, I can't bear it, I'm going to wipe my consciousness out. But the resistance couldn't hold up. It succumbed to temptation. So, but I still want to hear what Stephanie's going to say.
Sure. So this is definitely something that I'm still working through. But I think that for Adorno, the concept of authenticity, at least in relation to someone like Heidegger, is really grounded in the rejection of like reified society, and also in the rejection of the subject-object duality. So it's really about like that process, it is an ongoing process of restoring that dialectical relationship between subject and object. But then I also think that in negative dialectics, like at the end, or not at the end, but in the introduction, Adorno kind of has this utopian view as well that maybe could be his concept of authenticity, where he says, a right condition would be freed from dialectics, no more system than contradiction. So it's like, it's that process of embracing the contradiction to restore that dialectical relationship between subject and object, but then also going beyond that.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, thank you. So, Alison, that's it?
Yes.
Well, if there's no any other question, we will wrap up here. And please help me to thank Shierry Nicholsen for the beautiful talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
And is there any, Alessandro? Yeah. Do you want to say something?
Yes, I want to simply to thank everybody for attending today, and most people since this morning. In fact, I'm recognizing most faces around, but also for the very interesting conversation that we were able to carve up after each one of the presentations. So it was a really nice debate and connections between the different sessions that we had. I also want to thank not only the Institute of the Humanities, which is the main organizers, but also its partners at the Department of Humanities at SFU, as well as the generous support of the Dean's Office for Graduate Studies. And please follow us in our future events. We are trying as much as possible to create more and more series that revolve around the critical theory, continental philosophy, and questions of aesthetic in way that relate always to the social. So just keep posted. Thank you very much, everyone.